Silent strike. Marlo Thatcher had learned to make herself small. At Oak Ridge High School in suburban Chicago, she perfected the art of invisibility during those first September days, keeping her eyes down as she navigated the crowded hallways, her slight frame allowing her to slip through gaps in the human traffic without drawing attention. She wore oversized hoodies despite the lingering summer heat, muting the athletic build beneath baggy layers, and ate lunch in the far corner of the library where most students never ventured. The new student registration form had asked for emergency contacts, previous schools, medical information, but there was no checkbox for trained fighter trying to leave violence behind or carrying skills that could hospitalize someone in seconds. Those secrets stayed locked inside her chest, buried beneath the promise she'd made to her father before the cancer took him, his weathered hand gripping hers in that sterile hospital room as he'd whispered, "You're better than what I taught you to be. Better than me. Promise you'll never use it unless someone's life depends on it." She'd promised through her tears, and she'd meant it, even as she'd felt the weight of all that training settle into her bones like a second skeleton made of muscle memory and controlled violence. The main building of Oak Ridge High was a sprawling brick structure built in the 1960s, 3 stories of institutional architecture with endless corridors that smelled like floor wax and teenage anxiety. The cafeteria occupied the entire west wing of the first floor, a cavernous space where social hierarchies crystallized with brutal efficiency around rectangular tables. The gymnasium stood separate, connected by a covered walkway where frost would gather in winter months still to come. Marlo had mapped every exit during her first week, noted which bathrooms stayed empty during which periods, identified the back stairwell near the art room that most students ignored. Survival instincts died hard, even when you were trying to shed them like outgrown skin. She'd been invisible for exactly 9 days when Garrett Hawthorne first noticed her. He was everything Marlo wasn't, 6 feet of swagger and sculpted muscle from years as the varsity linebacker, with the kind of sharp-featured good looks that made teachers forgive late assignments and administrators overlook questionable behavior. His father owned half the commercial real estate in 3 surrounding suburbs, a fact Garrett dropped into conversations like pocket change, casual and constant. On that Tuesday morning in late September, Marlo was retrieving her chemistry textbook from her locker when she felt rather than saw him approach, his presence announcing itself through the sudden silence that fell over nearby students. She kept her movements economical, grabbed the book, started to close the metal door. "You're the new girl." Not a question. His voice carried the practiced tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "Marlo, right? Weird name." She nodded once, still not making eye contact, and tried to step around him. His arm shot out, palm flat against the locker beside her head, boxing her in without touching her. The movement was smooth, practiced. The physical grammar of someone who'd learned that space was something you took from others. Marlo's body responded before her mind could catch up, weight shifting to the balls of her feet, center of gravity dropping half an inch. But she forced herself to freeze mid-motion, to swallow the instinct that wanted to redirect his arm and create distance. "I'm talking to you," Garrett said, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively masculine. "It's rude not to answer when someone asks you a question." "Sorry," Marlo mumbled, the word tasting like ash. "Yeah, Marlo, where'd you transfer from? You don't talk like you're from around here." "Phoenix." The lie came easily. She'd actually spent the last 3 years in Colorado Springs, training at her father's gym 6 days a week, learning to take hits and give them back twice as hard. But Phoenix was what the paperwork said, and paperwork was harder to check. "We moved for my mom's job." Garrett studied her with the kind of calculating assessment that made Marlo's skin prickle. She kept her gaze somewhere around his collarbone, submissive body language that satisfied whatever he was looking for. After a moment that stretched too long, he stepped back, granting her release she hadn't asked for. "See you around, Phoenix," he said, the nickname already forming, and walked away with 2 other players from the football team falling into formation behind him like pilot fish trailing a shark. Marlowe exhaled slowly, her hands perfectly steady as she locked her locker and headed to chemistry class. 9 days of invisibility. Over. Now came the hard part. The pattern established itself over the following week, with the inevitability of storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. Tuesday afternoon, Garrett accidentally shouldered into her in the hallway between 3rd and 4th period, hard enough that her backpack flew from her grip and books scattered across the floor. He kept walking without breaking stride, while Marlowe knelt to collect her belongings, other students flowing around her like water around a stone. Wednesday morning, she found her locker vandalized with a crude drawing and the word freak in permanent marker. Thursday's incident came in the cafeteria, where someone, she didn't see who, bumped her tray so that chocolate milk splashed across her shirt and jeans. Friday brought more of the same, a steady drip of small humiliations that never quite crossed the line into something she could report without sounding paranoid or weak. Through it all, Marlowe maintained her carefully constructed persona of passivity. She cleaned up spilled milk without complaint, wore her stained shirt through the rest of the day, scrubbed the marker from her locker during lunch period. She never raised her voice, never met aggression with aggression, never gave them the reaction they were fishing for. But at night, alone in her bedroom in the small 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother on the south side of town, she moved through forms her body remembered better than her own phone number. Shadow boxing in silence, practicing the hip throws and arm drags her father had drilled into her before she'd hit puberty, flowing from guard to mount to rear naked choke on the worn mat she'd rolled out on the floor. The muscle memory was still there, sharp and ready, waiting beneath her skin like a loaded gun she'd sworn never to fire. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital, 12-hour days that meant Marlowe often ate dinner alone and fell asleep to the sound of medical dramas playing on the TV in the living room at 2 in the morning. They didn't talk about Colorado Springs or about why they'd left in the middle of a school year. They definitely didn't talk about the last tournament Marlowe had competed in, the one where she'd broken an opponent's orbital bone with an elbow strike that had been technically legal but spiritually wrong, the kind of violence that left everyone in the gym silent and uncomfortable. That was the night her father had pulled her aside, his face grey with something that might have been disappointment or might have been fear, and told her she was getting too good at hurting people, that the best fighters were the ones who never had to fight at all. 2 months later, he was diagnosed. 4 months after that, he was gone. And Marlowe had made her promise. By October, Garrett had recruited a proper crew. His right hand was Trent Castellano, a senior with a wrestler's build and the kind of casual cruelty that came from growing up in a house where affection was withheld like oxygen. Trent's specialty was the verbal evisceration, the cutting comment that found soft tissue and burrowed in. The third member was a girl named Sloane Merrick, beautiful in that porcelain doll way that made boys stupid and teachers protective, who'd latched onto Garrett sometime during sophomore year and never let go. Sloane's weapon was laughter, the high tinkling sound she made whenever Marlowe walked past, loud enough to carry but quiet enough to deny if challenged. The 3 of them began orchestrating incidents with increasing boldness. They'd trip Marlowe in the hallway and then apologize with theatrical sincerity when teachers looked their way. They'd start conversations that were clearly about her. Some people just don't belong here. Maybe if she actually tried to fit in. I heard her dad died or something super sad, loud enough for her to hear but directed at each other. They'd take photos when she was eating alone or walking with her head down, posting them to social media with captions that stopped just short of explicit bullying. Nothing that could be definitively proven, nothing that would bring administrative consequences, just a steady, grinding pressure designed to make Oak Ridge High School feel hostile and foreign and wrong. Marlowe endured. She'd survived worse. Sparring sessions where grown men had tried to take her head off. Tournaments where the mat had been slick with someone's blood. The long quiet of her father's final weeks, when morphine had taken him somewhere she couldn't follow. This was just high school. This would end. She kept her head down and counted the days and practiced her forms in the dark. The first Monday of October brought something new into her life, something she hadn't been expecting and didn't know how to process. His name was Dashiell Cross, though everyone called him Dash, and he sat down across from her in the library during lunch period without asking permission or offering explanation. He had dark, curly hair that fell over his forehead, olive skin suggesting Mediterranean ancestry, and hands marked with small scars and calluses that spoke of either guitar playing or climbing or both. When Marlowe looked up from her sandwich, startled by this invasion of her carefully maintained solitude, he was already pulling out his own lunch and a battered paperback with a dragon on the cover. "This seat taken?" he asked, though he was already sitting. "No," Marlowe said cautiously. She waited for the punchline, the setup for whatever prank Garrett had orchestrated, but Dash just nodded and opened his book, ate his sandwich in companionable silence. After 5 minutes, when nothing terrible had happened, she relaxed fractionally and returned to her own reading. They didn't speak again until the bell rang, and they both stood to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" Dash asked, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Up close, she noticed his eyes were hazel with flecks of gold, warm and direct, in a way that made her want to look away. "If you want," Marlowe said, non-committal, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the next day, he was there again, and the day after that. By Friday, they were actually talking, small exchanges about books and music and the soul-crushing boredom of Mr. Henderson's world history class. Dash had transferred to Oak Ridge the previous year from Portland, he told her. And yeah, he knew what it was like to be the new kid, to navigate social hierarchies that had calcified long before you arrived. He was into rock climbing, which explained the calluses, and played guitar in a garage band that practiced on weekends and had once almost played an actual gig before the venue had shut down for health code violations. He asked questions but didn't push when Marlowe's answers stayed vague. He had an easy laugh that made her chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. That weekend, Marlowe found herself thinking about Dash more than she should, replaying their conversations, wondering what his deal was, whether this was real friendship or some elaborate long game she couldn't see yet. She checked his social media profiles and found nothing suspicious, just normal posts about climbing trips and terrible band photos and jokes with friends, no connection to Garrett or his crew, no red flags. On Sunday night, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Dash BTW, got your number from the group chat for Henderson's class. Hope that's not creepy. Just wanted to say I'm glad you're here. This place is less boring with you in it." Marlowe stared at the message for a long time, her thumbs hovering over the keyboard, before finally typing back, "Not creepy. Glad you're here too." The following week, the bullying found a new gear. It started in the cafeteria on Tuesday. Marlowe had just sat down at her usual table in the corner when Garrett appeared with his full entourage, 8 or 9 kids trailing him like he was royalty making a procession. He stopped at her table, looked down at her with that calculating expression she'd come to recognize as dangerous, and then accidentally knocked her lunch tray off the table with his hip. Food exploded across the floor, spaghetti sauce like arterial spray, milk pooling, her apple rolling under an adjacent table. The cafeteria went quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was watching. "Oops," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false concern. "My bad, Phoenix. I'm so clumsy." Sloane's laughter cut through the silence like breaking glass. Marlowe looked down at the mess, her face burning, and started to stand to clean it up. But before she could move, Dash was there, kneeling beside her with a handful of napkins, helping to mop up the spill. "Leave it," Marlowe whispered urgently. "Just leave it." But Dash ignored her, gathering the broken tray, the scattered utensils. Other students were starting to resume their conversations, the moment passing, but Garrett hadn't moved. He stood there watching Dash help her, his expression shifting from satisfaction to something harder, more focused. "You her boyfriend or something, Cross?" Garrett asked. "I'm her friend," Dash replied evenly, not looking up from his task. "Which is more than I can say for you." The temperature in the cafeteria dropped 10 degrees. Marlowe's heart hammered against her ribs, her hands clenching involuntarily. She saw the way Garrett's jaw tightened, the way Trent moved half a step closer, flanking. This was escalating, in exactly the way she'd feared. "Watch your mouth," Garrett said quietly, and there was real menace in it now, the kind of threat that didn't need volume to land. "You don't want problems with me." "Then stop making them," Dash said, finally meeting Garrett's eyes. He stood slowly, the collected garbage in his hands, and for a moment Marlowe thought violence was going to erupt right there in the cafeteria. But then Dash turned and walked to the trash can, deposited the mess, and came back to help Marlowe to her feet. "Come on," he said to her. "I've got an extra sandwich in my locker." They left together while Garrett watched with eyes like flint, and Marlowe knew with absolute certainty that she'd just made everything worse for both of them. That night, a video started circulating on social media. Someone had filmed the cafeteria incident from an angle that made it look like Marlowe had dropped her own tray, with Garrett standing innocently nearby. The caption read, "New girl can't even handle lunch LOL," with crying, laughing emojis and tags that spread it through the school's social networks like contagion. By morning, it had 200 likes and 40 comments. Most of them variations on the same theme. She was clumsy, pathetic, weird, didn't belong. A few comments mentioned Dash, calling him a simp, and predicting he'd bail once he realized what a loser she was. Marlowe spent that night staring at her ceiling, her phone dark on her nightstand, resisting the urge to check the comments again. In the apartment below, someone was playing music too loud, bass thumping through the floor. In the apartment above, she could hear furniture scraping and muffled arguing. These walls were thin enough that everyone lived in everyone else's noise, but thick enough that no one acknowledged it. Perfect metaphor, she thought bitterly. Her phone buzzed. Dash again. "Ignore the video. You know what really happened." Marlowe typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on, "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." His reply came immediately. "You didn't. I walked in willingly. Besides, Garrett's been looking for a reason to come at me since last year. I dated his ex for like 2 weeks. He's been holding that grudge. Great. So this is about you, too. No, this is about him being a dick. Not the same thing. See you tomorrow?" "Yeah, tomorrow." She set her phone aside and rolled out her mat, needing to move, needing to feel her body do what it was trained to do. She flowed through a grappling sequence her father had taught her when she was 12, the kind of ground control that let a smaller fighter neutralize a larger opponent. Her hips bridged, her legs scissored, her arms found the ghost of an opponent's neck and squeezed with perfect pressure. In her mind, it wasn't Garrett she was choking out. It wasn't anyone, just technique, pure and clean and theoretical. She released the invisible neck and lay back on the mat, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling again. The promise to her father felt heavier every day. By the end of October, Dash had become a fixture in Marlowe's routine, and vice versa. They ate lunch together every day now, sometimes in the library, sometimes at a table in the far corner of the cafeteria where they could see trouble coming. They studied together after school when Marlowe's mother was working, sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment with textbooks spread between them, their knees occasionally bumping in the cramped space. Dash talked about Portland and about his younger sister, who was obsessed with horses, about the climbing gym downtown where he spent most weekends. Marlowe talked in vaguer terms about Phoenix and about her mother's exhausting hospital shifts, about her love of old noir films and the detective novels she devoured 3 at a time. She didn't talk about her father, or about Colorado Springs, or about the gym where she'd learned to break bones with calculated precision. Some doors stayed closed, but Dash noticed things. The way she moved, always balanced, always aware of exits, the calluses on her knuckles that she tried to hide, the reflex she couldn't quite suppress when someone moved too fast in her peripheral vision, that fractional flinch toward defensive posture before she caught herself. Once, walking to his car after school, he'd dropped his keys, and Marlowe's hand had snapped out to catch them before they hit the ground, a movement so quick it seemed to violate physics. "Jesus," Dash had said, staring at his keys in her palm. "You play baseball or something?" "Or something," Marlowe had replied, handing them back, her face carefully neutral. He didn't push, but she saw the speculation in his eyes, the questions he was too polite or too smart to ask directly. The major escalation came on Halloween, which fell on a Thursday that year. The school had banned costumes. Too disruptive, administration said, but everyone wore orange and black, and the hallways buzzed with plans for parties and trick-or-treating routes that were really just excuses to drink in someone's unsupervised basement. Marlowe had no plans beyond finishing her homework and maybe watching something scary on Netflix while her mother worked the night shift. Dash had invited her to a party at his friend's house, but she'd declined, not ready for that level of social immersion. The attack came during passing period between 5th and 6th in the crowded main hallway where 3 corridors intersected. Marlowe was walking alone. Dash had a different class in the science wing when someone shoved her hard from behind. She stumbled forward, caught herself on a locker with both hands, her backpack slipping from one shoulder. Before she could turn around, hands grabbed her backpack and yanked it completely off, and then she was surrounded by Garrett, Trent, and 2 other players from the football team whose names she didn't know. "Trick or treat, Phoenix," Garrett said, holding her backpack out of reach. "Let's see what the weird new girl carries around." He unzipped the main compartment and upended it, dumping the contents onto the floor. Textbooks thudded against linoleum, notebooks spilled open, pages fluttering, pens scattered in every direction, and then, tumbling out with everything else, came the thing Marlowe had hoped no one would ever see. A worn hand wrap, the kind fighters used under their gloves, faded black with frayed edges, and her father's initials stitched in the corner in gold thread. M.T. Marcus Thatcher, the only thing of his she'd kept. Trent picked it up, frowning. "What the hell is this?" "Looks like boxing wraps," one of the other players said. "You box, Phoenix?" Marlowe's heart was a drum solo against her ribs. The hallway had gone quiet again, students stopping to watch, phones appearing to record. She could feel her carefully constructed invisibility shattering like glass, could feel the truth she'd been hiding starting to leak through the cracks. "It's nothing," she said, her voice steady despite everything. She crouched to gather her belongings, moving methodically, not looking at any of them. "Just give it back. Just give it back," Sloane mimicked in a baby voice, and the crowd laughed. "Why do you have boxing wraps? You trying to be tough?" "She doesn't look tough," Garrett said, studying the wrap with exaggerated interest. "She looks like a stiff breeze would knock her over, but maybe she's got a secret." He looked at Marlowe, his eyes sharp. "You got a secret, Phoenix?" "No," Marlowe said. She reached for the wrap, but Garrett held it higher, playing keep-away like they were in elementary school. "Please, it was my dad's." The word "dad" changed something in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but calculation. He'd found a pressure point. "You're dead, Dad?" he asked, his voice dropping into mock solemnity. "Oh, man, that's rough. Must be really special to you then." "Don't," Marlowe whispered, but she hated how small her voice sounded, hated the tears she could feel building behind her eyes. Garrett looked at the rap again, then at Trent, then back at Marlowe. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that meant he'd just had an idea he thought was brilliant. "You know what? I'm going to hang on to this for safekeeping. Wouldn't want it to get lost or anything. Maybe if you ask nicely, I'll give it back sometime." "Give it back now," Marlowe said, and this time her voice was different, harder, with an edge she hadn't let show before. She stood slowly, leaving her scattered belongings on the floor, and looked Garrett directly in the eye for the first time since she'd arrived at Oak Ridge. "That's not yours." For a moment, just a heartbeat, Garrett's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. Marlowe had shifted her stance without thinking, weight distributed, hands loose at her sides, and there was something in her body language that screamed danger to anyone who knew how to read it. But then Trent laughed, breaking the tension, and Garrett's confidence reassembled itself. "Or what?" he said, stuffing the wrap into his pocket. "You going to fight me, Phoenix?" Marlowe didn't answer. Couldn't answer because the truth was yes. She wanted to fight him. Wanted it so badly her hands were shaking with it. Wanted to show him exactly what those wraps represented and what she could do with them. But her father's voice was in her head, steady and sad. "Promise me. Promise you'll never use it unless someone's life depends on it." And this wasn't life or death. This was just high school cruelty, just stolen property, just another test of whether she could keep her promises to the dead. "That's what I thought," Garrett said when she stayed silent. He stepped over her scattered belongings, his crew following, and the crowd began to disperse, disappointed that nothing more dramatic had happened. Dash found her 5 minutes later, still kneeling in the hallway, methodically collecting her books and papers and pens, her face set in rigid lines that suggested if she relaxed for even a second, she might shatter completely. He helped without speaking, restacked her textbooks, held her backpack open so she could load everything back in. When they'd collected the last scattered pen, he touched her shoulder gently. "What happened?" "They took something of mine," Marlowe said. Her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Something important." "What thing?" "It doesn't matter. I'll get it back." "Marlowe, I said it doesn't matter." She stood abruptly, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and for the first time since they'd met, she couldn't meet his eyes. "I need to get to class." She walked away before he could respond, her spine straight, her steps measured, and she didn't let herself cry until she was locked in a bathroom stall 3 hallways away, her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle the sound. That night, she texted Garrett from an account she'd created with a fake name. "I want my property back. Name your terms." His response came an hour later. "Come to the parking lot tomorrow after school. Maybe we can work something out." Marlowe stared at the message for a long time, reading the threat between the lines, understanding that working something out would mean another humiliation, another test, probably another viral video. But the rap was her father's, the only piece of him she had left except photographs and fading memories, and she'd made a promise about violence, but she'd never promised not to endure pain or embarrassment to honor his memory. "I'll be there," she typed back. The next afternoon, Friday, November 1st, Marlowe walked to the student parking lot at 3:30 with her heart in her throat and her hands loose at her sides. The lot was mostly empty, just a few dozen cars and the handful of students who had after-school activities or were in no rush to get home. Garrett's truck was parked in the back corner, a massive Ford F-250 with custom rims that probably cost more than Marlowe's mother made in 3 months. He was leaning against the driver's side door, with Trent and Sloane flanking him, and two other people she recognized from various classes but couldn't name. A reception committee. Marlowe walked up to them with her chin high, everything in her body language screaming confidence she didn't feel. "I'm here. Give me the wrap." "Not so fast," Garrett said. He pulled the wrap from his pocket, dangled it between thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated. "I've been thinking. You know what your problem is, Phoenix? You act like you're better than everyone, like you're above it all. Pisses people off." "I don't act like anything," Marlowe said. "I just want to be left alone." "See, that's the thing, though. You don't get to just be left alone. That's not how this works. You're at our school now. You're in our territory. So you play by our rules." "What rules are those?" Garrett smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Marlowe's stomach drop. "The rules where you show proper respect, where you acknowledge your place in the hierarchy. So here's the deal. You get on your knees, apologize for being a stuck-up bitch, and maybe I'll think about giving this back." The parking lot went very still. Sloane was recording on her phone, of course. Trent looked vaguely uncomfortable but said nothing. The other two students watched with the avid interest of people who knew they were witnessing something significant. Marlowe looked at the wrap, then at Garrett, then at the phone recording everything. She thought about her father, about the hospital room, about the promise. She thought about Dash and the lunch table, and the brief moment of friendship she'd managed to find in this hostile place. She thought about what kneeling would cost her, what it would mean, how the video would spread through the school like poison. "No," she said quietly. "What?" "No, I'm not doing that." Garrett's expression darkened. He pushed off the truck, stepped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "You think you have a choice here." "I think you're going to give me my property back," Marlowe said, and she heard her voice go flat, professional, the tone her father had used when he was teaching technique. "Or I'm going to take it from you." Trent laughed nervously. "Dude, is she seriously threatening you?" "Sounds like it," Garrett said. He was still smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. "You know what? Fuck it. You want it? Take it." He dropped the wrap on the ground between them, then stepped on it with his boot, grinding it against the asphalt. "Come on, tough girl. Take it back." Marlowe looked down at her father's wrap, her father's initials, crushed under Garrett's expensive sneaker. She felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been holding her together for months, starting to give way. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her breathing shifted, and for half a second she was back in Colorado Springs, back in the gym, back in the place where violence was answer and language and prayer all at once. "Last chance," Garrett said. "Get on your knees or walk away and never see this again." The rational part of Marlowe's brain understood this was a setup, that any physical response would be recorded and used against her, that fighting here would violate her promise and probably get her expelled. But the other part, the part her father had trained and honed and feared, was doing calculations. Garrett's stance was too wide, weight too far forward, hands unprotected. Trent was close enough to be a problem, but flat-footed, unprepared. Sloane would drop her phone if things got real. The other two would run. This wouldn't be a fight. It would be a demonstration. "No," the rational voice insisted. "Keep your promise. Walk away." But the rap was her father's. But the promise was to her father. "Marlowe," the voice came from behind her, familiar and concerned. She turned her head fractionally and saw Dash approaching across the parking lot, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he registered the scene. "Stay out of this, Cross," Garrett warned, but Dash kept walking until he was standing beside Marlowe, close enough that their arms almost touched. "What's going on?" "Just having a conversation," Garrett said. "Private conversation." "Doesn't look private." Dash looked at Marlowe, at the rap on the ground under Garrett's foot, at Sloane's phone still recording. "That yours?" he asked Marlowe. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Dash turned back to Garrett. "Give it back." "Or what? You gonna make me? If I have to?" The situation was balanced on a knife edge. 5 people in a parking lot, all making calculations about violence and consequences and how far they were willing to go. Marlowe could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, her vision sharpening the way it did before a match, and she knew with absolute certainty that if Garrett threw the first punch, she was going to break her promise and her father's trust and possibly Garrett's jaw, all in the next 3 seconds. But then a car pulled into the parking lot, a teacher's sedan with a faculty parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror, and the spell broke. Garrett stepped back, picked up the wrap, brushed it off with theatrical care. "You know what? Keep it. I'm bored with this game anyway." He tossed it at Marlowe, who caught it reflexively. "But we're not done, Phoenix. Not even close." He climbed into his truck, Trent and Sloane and the others scrambling to follow, and peeled out of the parking lot with unnecessary force, leaving rubber on the asphalt. The teacher's car parked 2 rows over, oblivious to what had almost happened. Marlowe stood there holding her father's wrap, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was draining, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "You okay?" Dash asked softly. "No," Marlowe admitted. "But I will be. That was intense. What did he want?" "To humiliate me. Same as always." "Yeah, but—" Dash paused, choosing words carefully. "You looked different just then. Like you were about to do something." Marlowe finally looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the sharp intelligence in those hazel eyes, the way he was putting pieces together. "I wasn't going to do anything." "Okay," Dash said, but she could tell he didn't quite believe her. "Can I give you a ride home?" She wanted to say no, to maintain her walls and her secrets, but she was suddenly exhausted beyond measure, hollowed out and running on empty. "Yeah," she said. "That would be good." They walked to his car, an ancient Honda Civic with mismatched doors and a bumper sticker about climbing, and drove in silence toward her apartment. Halfway there, at a red light, Dash spoke without looking at her. "Whatever you're hiding, it's your business. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. No judgment." Marlowe clutched her father's wrap in both hands, feeling the frayed edges, the gold thread of his initials. "It's complicated. Most things worth hiding are." The light turned green. They drove the rest of the way without speaking, and when Dash dropped her off in front of her building, she paused with her hand on the door handle. "Thank you," she said, "for showing up." "That's what friends do," Dash replied simply. Marlowe climbed out, watched him drive away, and went upstairs to her empty apartment where she locked the door and cried for the first time in months. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, mourning her father and her lost invisibility, and the promise that was getting harder to keep with every passing day. November slid into deeper cold, and with it came a shift in Garrett's strategy. The physical confrontations decreased, but something more insidious took their place, a comprehensive campaign of social destruction. Someone created a fake social media account in Marlowe's name and used it to post increasingly unhinged messages, rants about other students, bizarre conspiracy theories, thirsty comments on random people's photos. By the time she found out and reported it, the damage was done. Teachers started looking at her differently. Students she'd never spoken to whispered when she walked past. The guidance counselor called her in for a wellness check that felt more like an interrogation. Dash stuck by her through all of it, which only seemed to make things worse. Garrett's crew started targeting him too, spreading rumors that he was sleeping with her, that they'd been caught together in various compromising positions, that he'd abandoned his actual friends to White Knight for the weird new girl. His bandmates stopped responding to his texts. People he'd known since middle school suddenly couldn't make eye contact. The social isolation was surgical and complete. "You should distance yourself from me," Marlowe told him one afternoon in mid-November, sitting in his car in the school parking lot after everyone else had left. "This isn't your fight." "Fuck that," Dash said, with more vehemence than she'd heard from him before. "I'm not abandoning you because some asshole wants to play king of the mountain. Besides, I always kind of hated most of those people anyway. You had friends. A social life. I ruined that." "No, Garrett ruined that. There's a difference." He turned in his seat to face her fully. "And honestly, I'd rather have one real friend than a dozen fake ones who bail the second things get complicated." Marlowe felt something warm and dangerous bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope, or maybe something even scarier. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," Dash said with a crooked smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway." They started spending more time together outside of school. Dash took her climbing at the downtown gym one Saturday, and Marlowe discovered she loved the puzzle of it, the way routes demanded both strength and strategy. She was good at it too, her trained body awareness translating perfectly to the wall, though she had to consciously dial back her intensity when other climbers started staring. They studied at coffee shops instead of the school library, went to an indie film festival at the Art House Cinema downtown, drove out to the Forest Preserve one Sunday afternoon and hiked until their legs ached. And they talked. Real conversations that went deeper than surface pleasantries about parents and pressure and the constant low-grade anxiety of trying to figure out who you were supposed to become. Dash told her about his parents' divorce when he was 9, about moving to Portland with his mom and sister while his dad stayed in Chicago. Marlowe told him about her mother's exhaustion, about medical bills that never seemed to end, about feeling like she'd failed somehow by not being enough to make her father want to live more than the cancer wanted to kill him. "That's not how cancer works," Dash said gently, his hand finding hers in the dark of the movie theater during a film neither of them were really watching. "It's not about wanting. I know that rationally," Marlowe said. "But knowing and feeling are different things." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, and she didn't pull away. The first kiss happened in late November, the week before Thanksgiving break, in the front seat of his car after he'd driven her home from a study session that had devolved into just talking for 3 hours straight. The streetlight outside her building painted everything amber and shadow, and when Dash leaned across the center console, Marlowe met him halfway. It was soft and brief and tasted like the peppermint tea he'd been drinking, and when they broke apart, both of them were smiling like idiots. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Dash admitted. "Me too," Marlowe said, and kissed him again, longer this time, her hand curling into his shirt. They made it official on social media the next day, a simple photo of them together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, captioned with a single heart emoji. The response was immediate and predictable. Within an hour, Garrett had commented, "Congrats on locking down the only person desperate enough to date you." Sloane added crying, laughing emojis. Trent wrote something cruder that got deleted by whoever monitored these things, but there were other comments too, from people Marlowe didn't know or barely recognized, saying they looked happy together, that it was about time, that they made a cute couple. "Ignore the assholes," Dash texted her that night. "Focus on the good stuff." But ignoring Garrett was becoming harder because he wasn't satisfied with just online harassment anymore. He'd found a new strategy, systematically sabotaging anything that brought Marlowe and Dash joy. When Dash's band finally booked a real gig at a small venue near campus, someone called in a fake bomb threat that got the show cancelled. When Marlowe submitted an essay to the school literary magazine that the advisor had praised, it mysteriously never made it to the final publication, and the advisor claimed she'd never received it despite their email exchange. Small cruelties that were impossible to definitively pin on Garrett, but bore his fingerprints nonetheless. The breaking point approached slowly, like a storm building on the horizon, visible for days before it arrived. In early December, the school announced the annual winter formal, a semi-formal dance held in the gymnasium, transformed with fairy lights and rented decorations into something almost magical. Marlowe had never been to a school dance, had never particularly wanted to, but when Dash asked her with nervous formality in the school parking lot one frozen afternoon, she found herself saying yes before her brain caught up with her mouth. They went dress shopping together, which felt absurdly domestic and sweet, Dash waiting patiently outside dressing rooms and offering genuine opinions on colours and cuts. Marlowe settled on something simple, deep blue, that made her feel like someone other than the girl who ate lunch alone and hid from conflict. Dash rented a suit that made him look older, more serious, and when he picked her up on the night of the dance, her mother actually teared up and took 17 photos on her phone, despite Marlowe's protests. The first hour at the dance was perfect. They danced badly but enthusiastically, laughed at the terrible DJ's music choices, snuck outside to the parking lot for fresh air, and stolen kisses in the cold December night. Marlowe felt, for perhaps the first time since arriving at Oak Ridge, like she actually belonged somewhere, like this could be her life, instead of just a holding pattern until she could escape to college. Then Garrett arrived. He'd brought a date, some sophomore Marlowe didn't recognize, pretty and nervous and clearly out of her depth, but his attention wasn't on her. It was on Marlowe and Dash, tracking them across the gymnasium with predatory focus. He danced close enough to bump into them, apologized with theatrical insincerity. He and his crew occupied the refreshment table, forcing Marlowe and Dash to navigate around them for drinks. Small provocations, carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold where teachers would intervene. "Just ignore him," Dash murmured in Marlowe's ear as they slow danced to some generic pop ballad. "He's trying to get a reaction." "I know," Marlowe said, but her body was tense, ready, the way it got before a fight. She could feel her control fraying at the edges, the promise to her father feeling less like honor and more like a cage. The attack came during the last song of the night, when everyone was tired and teachers had started to lose their vigilance. Marlowe and Dash were near the back of the gym, by the emergency exit that led to the athletics fields, and Marlowe didn't see Sloane approaching until it was too late. Something cold and wet hit her back. Punch from the smell of it, the entire contents of a plastic cup dumped down the back of her dress. She gasped at the shock of it, fabric clinging to her skin, and spun to find Sloane standing there with an empty cup and an expression of exaggerated shock. "Oh, my God, I'm so sorry," Sloane exclaimed, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "I'm so clumsy. Are you okay?" "You did that on purpose," Marlowe said, her voice low and dangerous. "It was an accident." "I swear," Sloane's eyes were bright with malicious glee. "God, some people are so paranoid." Dash was already moving, grabbing napkins from a nearby table, but Marlowe stood frozen, punch dripping down her back, the beautiful blue dress ruined, and something inside her finally snapped. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. She was done. Done pretending, done enduring, done keeping promises to ghosts while living people tortured her with impunity. "This ends now," Marlowe said so quietly that only Sloane could hear. "What are you going to do about it?" Sloane shot back, dropping the act now that no teachers were in immediate earshot. "Cry? Run away? You're pathetic." Marlowe didn't respond. She walked to the bathroom with Dash trailing behind her, locked herself in a stall, and stood there breathing carefully while her hands shook with rage and humiliation and something that felt like decision. When she came out, she'd wiped most of the punch from her skin, and wrung out as much as she could from her dress, but she was still sticky and cold and done. "Take me home," she told Dash. "Marlowe, please, just take me home." They left through the side exit, missing the drama when a couple of seniors got caught making out in the chemistry lab and drove in silence to Marlowe's apartment. When Dash pulled up outside her building, he turned off the engine and sat there, his hands still on the steering wheel. "What did you mean when you told Sloane it ends now?" he asked. Marlowe stared straight ahead at the dark street, the broken streetlight that had been broken since they'd moved in, the bus stop where homeless people sometimes slept. "I meant I'm not going to be their victim anymore." "Okay. What does that mean practically?" "I don't know yet." She turned to look at him, this boy who'd chosen her friendship when everyone else had chosen safety, who'd stood beside her despite every social cost. "But I need you to know something. About me, about my past. You don't have to. I want to." Marlowe took a breath. "My dad owned a gym in Colorado Springs. Not like a regular gym. An MMA gym. He trained fighters, taught jiu-jitsu and boxing and Muay Thai, and he trained me. From the time I was 8 until he got sick, I competed, I won a lot." Dash processed this, his expression thoughtful. "That explains some things. Last year I was in a tournament, big one with scouts and sponsors. I was winning my division easily, and in the finals my opponent and I got tangled up, and I threw an elbow that caught her wrong, broke her orbital bone in 3 places. It was technically legal, but—" Marlowe's throat tightened. It was excessive. "I knew it was excessive when I threw it. I was angry about something stupid, and I took it out on her. My dad pulled me aside after and told me I was getting too comfortable with violence, that I needed to stop before I became something he couldn't recognize. Then he got diagnosed, and before he died, he made me promise I'd never use my training unless someone's life was actually in danger. Not for ego, not for revenge, just for survival." "And you've been keeping that promise," Dash said slowly. "Even with Garrett." "Trying to. But it's getting harder. Dash, I could hurt him. Badly. I could have ended all of this months ago. Every time he touches me, every time he gets in my space, I have to consciously stop myself from reacting the way I'm trained to react. And I don't know how much longer I can keep doing that." Dash reached across the console and took her hand. "What if you didn't have to keep doing that? What if we found another way?" "What other way?" "Report it again. We've tried that. Teachers don't care. Administrators don't care. He's untouchable because his dad donates money to the football program." "Then we make it impossible for them to ignore," Dash said. "We document everything. We get other victims to come forward. We build a case so solid they have to act." Marlowe wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in systems and procedures and the idea that adults would eventually do the right thing. But she'd spent months watching those systems fail, watching adults look away, watching the hierarchy protect itself at the expense of the vulnerable. Still, for Dash, she was willing to try one more time. "Okay," she said, "one more shot, but if this doesn't work, then we'll figure out what comes next," Dash finished. "Together." He walked her to her building's entrance, kissed her goodnight with careful tenderness, and drove away. Marlowe went upstairs, peeled off the ruined dress, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her father's voice echoing in her head, "Promise me." She'd made that promise, but promises to the dead were getting harder to keep when the living kept pushing. The week after the winter formal, Marlowe and Dash implemented their plan. They started collecting evidence, screenshots of every harassing post, recordings of verbal harassment when they could get them, written statements from other students who'd been victimized by Garrett and his crew. It was slow work, like building a case one brick at a time, but they were methodical. 3 other students came forward privately, sharing their own stories of intimidation and bullying. One was a freshman who'd been thrown into a locker hard enough to crack his glasses. Another was a girl from Marlowe's history class who'd been sexually harassed by Trent for weeks. The third was a former friend of Garrett's who'd been iced out of their social circle for the crime of dating someone Garrett had briefly hooked up with at a party. They compiled everything into a detailed report and submitted it to the assistant principal, then to the principal, then to the district superintendent when the first two did nothing. They waited for responses that never came or came as empty promises. We're looking into it. We take these allegations seriously. We'll follow up with all parties involved. Bureaucratic language that meant nothing was actually going to change. By mid-December, a week before winter break, Marlowe realized Dash's plan had failed. The systems designed to protect students had been captured by the same power structures that enabled bullies in the first place. Garrett's father had too much influence, and Garrett himself was too valuable to the football program's winning season. The reports had gone nowhere except into some filing cabinet to gather dust. "I'm sorry," Dash said when it became clear their documentation campaign had been for nothing. They were sitting in his car again. They had so many important conversations in this car, watching snow fall in the grocery store parking lot near her apartment. "I really thought it would work." "It's not your fault," Marlowe said. "Systems protect power. That's what they're designed to do. So, what now?" Marlowe was silent for a long moment, watching snowflakes collect on the windshield. "Now, I stop waiting for someone else to save me." "Marlowe, I'm not going to hurt him," she interrupted. "I'm not going to break my promise. But I'm also not going to keep being a victim. There's space between those two things. I'm going to find it." Over winter break, Marlowe returned to training seriously for the first time since her father's death. She found a gym on the south side that ran open mat sessions, no questions asked, and spent hours drilling techniques she'd neglected for months. The familiarity of it was both comforting and painful. The smell of the mats, the sound of bodies hitting canvas, the burn in her muscles that meant she was working hard enough. She rolled with people twice her size and held her own, submitted blue belts and gave purple belts actual problems, and remembered what it felt like to be competent and dangerous instead of prey. She wasn't training to hurt Garrett. She was training to remember who she was before fear and promises had made her small. On the last day of break, Dash came over to her apartment for the first time. Her mother was working a double shift, and they ordered pizza and watched old horror movies on her laptop, curled up together on her bed in a way that felt simultaneously innocent and charged with possibility. During a particularly ridiculous scene where the monster was clearly just a guy in a rubber suit, Dash paused the movie and turned to face her. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If Garrett pushes you again, really pushes you, I mean, are you going to be able to hold back?" Marlowe considered lying, offering reassurance she didn't feel, but Dash deserved honesty. "I don't know. I want to, but I honestly don't know anymore. Would it help if I was there, like as a witness or backup or whatever? Or you could get hurt." "So could you," Dash pointed out. "Maybe we're safer together." Marlowe kissed him instead of answering, and they stayed like that for a while, the movie forgotten. The snow still falling outside her window, the world narrowed down to just this moment, this room, this person who'd chosen to see her as someone worth defending when everyone else had chosen to look away. Spring semester began in January with a false sense of normalcy. The first 2 weeks passed without major incident. Garrett and his crew seemed distracted by playoffs for basketball and midterm exams, and Marlowe dared to hope that maybe the break had reset something, that maybe she'd be allowed to finish the school year in peace. Then came the Friday in late January that shattered everything. It started in AP Biology 5th period, a class Marlowe shared with both Garrett and Sloane. They sat at different lab stations, Marlowe with Dash, Garrett with Trent, Sloane with another girl from the volleyball team, but the room wasn't big enough to create real distance. Mr. Peterson was lecturing about cellular respiration, his monotone voice making even the miracle of metabolic processes sound boring. And Marlowe was taking notes when she felt something hit the back of her head, a wadded-up piece of paper. She ignored it. Another one hit her shoulder, then another. She turned around slowly and found Garrett looking at her with that smile she'd learned to hate, the one that meant he was bored and looking for entertainment. He mouthed something she didn't catch. She turned back around. "Ignore him," Dash whispered beside her. But Garrett wasn't done. He stood up suddenly, making a show of needing to get something from his backpack, and on his way back to his seat, he accidentally bumped into Marlowe's lab stool hard enough that she nearly fell. She caught herself on the desk, her notes scattering, and Mr. Peterson looked up from his lecture long enough to frown in their direction before continuing. "Oops," Garrett said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Guess you should pay more attention." Marlowe took a breath, held it, counted to 5. Let it out. Bent to pick up her scattered notes. She was okay. She could handle this. She'd handled worse. But Garrett wasn't done. "I mean, it's not surprising," he continued, still standing in the aisle, performing for the class now. "She's kind of out of it most of the time, right? Like she's not really here. Zombie girl." A few people laughed nervously. Sloane's high-pitched giggle cut through the room. Mr. Peterson frowned more deeply, but didn't actually intervene. "Garrett, sit down," Dash said, his voice tight. "Or what, Cross? You going to fight me for your girlfriend? That's cute. Does she need you to protect her? Can't she defend herself?" The question hung in the air, laden with meaning Garrett didn't fully understand, but was grasping at anyway. Marlowe felt her hands curl into fists under the desk, felt her breathing shift, felt the promise to her father war with the humiliation burning in her chest. "That's enough," Mr. Peterson finally said, but without any real authority. "Garrett, sit down. Everyone else, focus on your notes." Garrett took his time, walking back to his seat, making sure to bump into Marlowe's desk one more time, harder, so her notes scattered again. And this time, when Marlowe bent to pick them up, she saw Sloane recording on her phone, that familiar predatory gleam in her eyes. The rest of the class passed in tense silence, but Marlowe could feel eyes on her, could sense the entire room waiting for something to break. When the bell finally rang, she gathered her things quickly, wanting to get out before anything else could happen. But Garrett was faster. He positioned himself in the doorway, blocking the exit, his bulk making it impossible to pass without squeezing past him. Students filed around him, but when Marlowe tried to do the same, he shifted his weight, staying in her way. "Excuse me," Marlowe said quietly. "What's the magic word?" "Please." "Nah, not good enough." Garrett leaned against the doorframe, casual and menacing. "Try again." Behind her, Marlowe could hear Dash approaching, could sense Mr. Peterson gathering his things at his desk, oblivious, or choosing to be oblivious. The hallway beyond was filling with students heading to 6th period, lunch, freedom. She just needed to get past this doorway, and she'd be safe for another hour. "Please let me pass," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Since you asked so nicely." Garrett stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, bowing slightly. "After you, Princess." Marlowe moved past him, Dash close behind her, and she thought that was it, that she'd survived another encounter, another small humiliation, another test of her promise. But she'd taken only 3 steps into the hallway when hands shoved her from behind, hard, violent, with enough force to send her stumbling forward. She spun instinctively as she fell, her training overriding conscious thought, and saw not just Garrett but Trent too, both of them having pushed her simultaneously, and time dilated the way it did in the ring, everything moving in slow motion while her brain processed at lightning speed. She could fall. Take the humiliation, the physical pain of hitting the floor, the laughter that would follow, keep her promise, or she could fight back. Her body made the choice before her mind caught up. As she spun, her weight already shifting, her hands already moving to defensive positions, she saw the opening, saw both of them off balance from the force of their own shove, saw them expecting her to fall and therefore unprepared for her not to. Garrett was slightly ahead, Trent to his left, and Marlowe's father's training took over like she'd been programmed, each movement flowing into the next with practiced inevitability. She dropped her level and shot under Garrett's reaching arms, got her shoulder into his midsection, wrapped her arms around his thighs in a perfect double-leg takedown. His size should have made him immovable, but physics didn't care about mass when technique was perfect. She drove with her legs, lifted with her arms, and Garrett went down hard, his back hitting the linoleum with a sound like a thunderclap. Before he could process what had happened, Marlowe transitioned, sliding around to side control, using her base to pin him, one arm trapping his head, her weight distributed so he couldn't bridge or roll. The entire sequence had taken maybe 3 seconds. Trent recovered from his shock and lunged at her, trying to pull her off Garrett, and this was the dangerous part, the part where she could really hurt someone if she wasn't careful. She released Garrett and turned to face Trent, her hands up in a proper guard, and when he grabbed at her, she used his momentum against him, got a collar tie on his neck and snapped his head down while driving her knee up. She pulled the knee at the last second, so it barely made contact with his chest instead of his face, but the control was absolute. She'd shown him she could have hurt him badly, and had chosen not to. Trent stumbled back, eyes wide, and Garrett was trying to get up, his face red with rage and embarrassment, and the hallway had gone completely silent, dozens of students watching with phones out, recording everything, and Marlowe stood there in a fighting stance, feet shoulder-width apart, weight on the balls of her feet, hands up and ready, and felt simultaneously exhilarated and horrified at what she'd just done. "You bitch," Garrett snarled, finally getting to his feet. "You're dead." He rushed her, and this time there was real violence in it, not play or intimidation, but actual intent to hurt. Marlowe sidestepped, parried his wild haymaker punch, got an underhook, and used his momentum to throw him again, a textbook hip toss that sent him sailing over her hip and crashing down a second time. This time she didn't follow him to the ground, didn't want to, didn't need to. She just stepped back, reset her stance, and waited. The class erupted. Not laughing at her this time, but something else. Shock, awe, a few actual cheers. Phones were everywhere, recording from every angle. Dash was beside her suddenly, his hand on her arm. "Marlowe," he said, urgent and worried, "we should go." But Marlowe barely heard him. She was watching Garrett push himself up slowly, blood from a split lip painting his teeth red, his expression cycling through rage and humiliation, and something that might have been fear. She'd broken her promise. She'd used her training. But no one's life had been in danger. Just her dignity, just her right to not be shoved around, just her basic human need to not be treated like prey. Teachers were running now, voices shouting, but Marlowe didn't move. She kept her eyes on Garrett, watched him realize what all those months of cruelty had been hiding. She wasn't weak. She'd never been weak. She'd been choosing mercy every single day, and he'd mistaken that mercy for helplessness. "You're done," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You understand me? You don't touch me again. You don't touch Dash. You don't touch anyone I care about. This is over." Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, and in that moment of hesitation, Mr. Peterson and 2 other teachers arrived, pulling students back, demanding to know what happened, and everyone started talking at once. But Marlowe kept her eyes on Garrett, and she saw it, the moment he understood that the balance of power had shifted, that fear was contagious, and it was flowing in a different direction now. "Everyone step back," Mr. Peterson was saying. "What is going on here?" "She attacked us," Sloane immediately said, pushing forward with her phone still recording. "We have it on video." "She just freaked out and attacked them." "That's bullshit," someone else said. a girl Marlowe didn't know well, a junior with purple hair. They shoved her first. I saw it. So did I, another voice confirmed. Garrett and Trent pushed her. She was just defending herself. She threw them like they were nothing, someone else added with what sounded like admiration. It was insane. More voices joined in, students who'd remained silent for months, suddenly eager to speak. And Marlowe realized with distant surprise that maybe she hadn't been as alone as she'd thought, that maybe other people had been waiting for someone to stand up first to show that Garrett wasn't invincible after all. The assistant principal arrived, a stocky woman named Dr. Morrison, who'd ignored Marlowe's previous reports with bureaucratic efficiency. Everyone not involved, clear this hallway now. Garrett, Marlowe, Trent, my office. The rest of you get to class. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, students still filming, still talking, and Marlowe let Dash squeeze her hand once before she followed Dr. Morrison down the hallway. Garrett was limping slightly, his lip still bleeding. Trent looked shaken, his face pale, and Marlowe felt oddly calm, centered in a way she hadn't felt in months. She'd broken her promise to her father, but somehow she didn't think he'd be angry. She'd defended herself. She'd shown restraint, even in violence, had controlled her techniques, pulled her strikes, hurt no one more than absolutely necessary to stop the situation. That had to count for something. The meeting in Dr. Morrison's office lasted over an hour. Garrett claimed Marlowe had attacked without provocation. Marlowe gave her version, calm and factual, emphasizing that she'd been shoved first. Dr. Morrison pulled up footage from the hallway security cameras and from 3 separate students who'd been recording, and even she couldn't deny what was obvious. Marlowe had been assaulted, and she'd responded with controlled self-defense. You could have seriously injured them, Dr. Morrison said, her tone caught between accusation and something that might have been respect. That level of force was necessary to stop an assault, Marlowe interrupted, and I pulled every technique. I could have done much worse. I chose not to. Dr. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. You have training. Yes, ma'am. Why didn't you mention that before? I was trying not to use it. Marlowe met her eyes steadily. I've been trying not to use it for months. But I'm done being a punching bag for your school's hierarchy. The words hung there, an accusation Dr. Morrison couldn't quite dismiss. Finally, she sighed. I'm going to review all the evidence, including the reports you and Mr. Cross filed earlier this year. You're all suspended pending investigation. 3 days for you, 5 for Garrett and Trent, given their instigation. Your parents will be contacted, dismissed. Marlowe walked out of the office to find Dash waiting in the hallway, his face tight with worry. When he saw her, he stood quickly. You okay? Suspended, Marlowe said. 3 days. Worth it? Marlowe thought about the feeling of refusing to be pushed anymore, the look on Garrett's face when he'd realized he couldn't dominate her, the sound of other students finally speaking up. Yeah, worth it. They walked out of the building together into the bright January cold, and Marlowe felt lighter than she had in months. She'd broken her promise, yes. But maybe some promises were made to be outgrown, adapted, reinterpreted through lived experience. Her father had told her never to use violence except for survival. But wasn't there a kind of survival in refusing to let yourself be destroyed incrementally, humiliation by humiliation? Wasn't there honor in finally saying no? She didn't have answers yet. But for the first time since arriving at Oak Ridge, she felt like herself, not the invisible girl, not the victim, but Marlowe Thatcher, trained fighter, decent human, someone who'd finally found the line between mercy and self-annihilation. The 3 days of suspension passed in strange quiet. Her mother had been called at work, had come home early for a conversation Marlowe had been dreading, but which turned out differently than expected. Instead of anger, her mother had asked careful questions, had reviewed the security footage that Marlowe showed her on her phone, and had finally pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. Your father would be proud, she'd whispered into Marlowe's hair. You held back, even when you had every right not to. That's the hard part. That's what he wanted you to learn. They'd spent the 3 days together, as much as her mother's shifts allowed, cooking meals, watching movies, having the kinds of conversations they'd been too exhausted and grief-stricken to have since the funeral. Marlowe told her about Dash, about the months of bullying, about the weight of keeping promises to the dead. Her mother listened without judgment and shared her own stories from high school, her own experiences with cruelty and survival and the complicated ethics of fighting back. The world isn't black and white, her mother said on the second night, both of them curled up on the couch with mugs of hot chocolate. Your father knew that. He wasn't telling you never to defend yourself. He was telling you to make sure the violence was proportional, necessary, controlled. And from what I saw on that video, you did exactly that. Marlowe wanted to believe her. Mostly she did. Dash came over every afternoon bringing homework assignments and gossip from school. The video of the fight had gone viral within the building, not leaked to broader social media, thankfully, but passed from phone to phone until basically everyone at Oak Ridge had seen it. The response was mixed, but trending in Marlowe's favor. Garrett's crew was still defending him, but their voices were quieter now, less certain. Other students were coming forward with their own stories of harassment, emboldened by Marlowe's example. A freshman had filed a report about Trent. The girl from history class had finally gone to the police about the sexual harassment. The dominoes were falling. Garrett's freaking out, Dash reported on the third day. His dad's been at the school every day, threatening lawsuits, demanding you be expelled. But there's too much evidence now, too many people talking. Dr. Morrison can't sweep this under the rug like she did before. What about you? Marlowe asked. They were sitting on her bed, supposedly doing calculus homework, actually just talking. How are people treating you? Like I'm dating a superhero, Dash said with a crooked smile. Guys I haven't talked to in months are suddenly my best friends. It's weird and kind of annoying, but better than being a social pariah. Sorry about that. Don't be. I meant what I said. I'd rather have one real thing than 100 fake ones. He paused, then added carefully, Can I ask you something? Sure. When you were throwing them, when you had them down, were you scared at all of hurting them too much? Marlowe considered the question honestly. In the moment, number. My body just did what it's trained to do, but immediately after, yeah. I was terrified I'd gone too far, that I'd become the thing my dad was afraid I'd become. But you didn't. You pulled your strikes. You stopped when you could have kept going. That's control. Or maybe just luck. I don't think you do anything by luck, Dash said. He reached out and took her hand, threaded their fingers together. You're kind of amazing, you know that. Marlowe felt her face heat. I'm really not. You really are. You spent months being tortured and you never became cruel back. You defended yourself without becoming a bully. You kept your humanity even when no one would have blamed you for losing it. That's not luck. That's character. She kissed him then, pouring all her gratitude and affection and relief into it. And they stayed like that for a long time. The calculus homework forgotten, the suspension clock ticking down toward Monday and whatever would come next. Returning to school was surreal. Marlowe walked through the main entrance Monday morning with Dash beside her, both of them tense and ready for backlash. But what they found was silence. Not hostile silence, more like uncertainty, like the student body hadn't quite figured out the new rules yet. People stared, yes, but many looked away when she met their eyes. A few nodded in what might have been respect. One girl she'd never spoken to stopped her in the hallway. I just wanted to say thank you, the girl said quietly, for standing up to him. He's been awful to a lot of us, and no one ever... Anyway, thank you. She hurried away before Marlowe could respond, leaving her standing in the middle of the hallway, feeling disoriented and oddly emotional. The day continued in similar fashion: small kindnesses, careful distance from Garrett's remaining crew, teachers who actually made eye contact with her for once. Mr. Peterson approached her before biology class. "I owe you an apology," he said, his normally dull voice unusually serious. "I should have intervened earlier. I should have done my job. I'm sorry." "Thank you," Marlowe said, because what else could she say? Garrett and Trent weren't back yet, their suspensions were longer, and rumor had it Garrett's father was negotiating some kind of alternative consequence to avoid having a violent incident on his son's record. Sloane was there, but she'd gone subdued, her usual sharp edges dulled. She didn't approach Marlowe, didn't make eye contact, just moved through the halls like a ghost of her former self. By the end of the week, a new normal was establishing itself. Marlowe and Dash ate lunch at a table with actual other people: the purple-haired girl who'd spoken up during the fight, a couple of Dash's former bandmates who'd cautiously returned, a few students from Marlowe's classes who were shy but friendly. It wasn't a large group, but it was real, and Marlowe found herself laughing at jokes and participating in conversations about movies and music and the absolute hell that was AP chemistry. Garrett returned the following Monday, and the hallway went quiet when he appeared. He looked different, not just the fading bruises, but something in his posture, like he'd been deflated somehow. He avoided Marlowe completely, took different routes through the building, ate lunch at a different time. His crew had scattered. Trent was facing possible criminal charges for the sexual harassment. Sloane had transferred to another school, according to rumors, and the others had found new social groups that didn't require cruelty as currency. 3 weeks after the fight, Marlowe was walking to her locker after school when she found Garrett waiting there. Her body tensed automatically, but he held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to start anything," he said quickly. Can I talk to you for a second?" Dash appeared at Marlowe's elbow, protective and wary, but she nodded. "Talk." Garrett looked at the floor, at the lockers, anywhere but at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the way I treated you. It was wrong." Marlowe waited, sensing there was more. "My dad's been on my ass my entire life," Garrett continued. "Nothing's ever good enough for him. I take out my frustration on other people because—" He trailed off, shook his head. "That's not an excuse. I'm just trying to explain. After what happened, he went ballistic, but my mom, she actually sat me down and made me watch all those videos. Made me see what I looked like. And it was ugly. I was ugly." "You were," Marlowe agreed quietly. "Yeah." Garrett finally looked at her. "I know this doesn't fix anything. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to. But I'm in therapy now. Real therapy. Not just anger management to avoid legal consequences. And I'm trying to be better. Different. I don't know if I can be, but I'm trying." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, this person who'd made her life hell for months, who'd pushed her to the breaking point, who'd forced her to choose between promises and self-preservation. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness would take time, if it came at all, but she could see something in his face that hadn't been there before. Shame, maybe, or the beginning of actual self-awareness. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you for apologizing. Is there anything I can do to make it right?" "Yeah, leave me alone. Leave Dash alone. Leave everyone alone. And if you see someone else getting bullied, do something about it instead of being the one doing it." Garrett nodded slowly. "Okay, I can do that." He walked away without another word, and Dash let out a breath he'd been holding. "That was weird," he said. "Yeah," Marlowe agreed, "but maybe good weird? Maybe." They went to Dash's car and drove to their usual coffee shop, and sitting there with terrible mochas and a shared muffin, Marlowe felt something settle in her chest. Not closure exactly, that was probably too strong a word, but maybe the beginning of moving forward. She'd defended herself and survived. She'd kept enough of her promise to honor her father's memory while adapting it to fit reality. She'd found friendship and something that felt like love, and a community that had finally decided to stand with her instead of against her. The rest of the semester passed without major incident. Garrett kept his distance, and as far as Marlowe could tell, genuinely tried to be less terrible. He didn't become her friend. They'd never be friends, but he stopped being her enemy, and that was enough. Other students who'd been victims of the old regime began to relax, to take up space, to laugh more freely in the hallways. The school implemented new anti-bullying protocols that might or might not mean anything, but at least they were trying. Marlowe kept training, but differently now, not out of fear or suppression, but as simple maintenance of skills that were part of her identity. She took Dash to her gym one Saturday and taught him basic self-defense, laughing as he struggled with hip throws and guard passes. They spent hours on the mat, drilling and laughing and occasionally kissing when they should have been focusing on technique. In March, on the first warm day that hinted at spring, Marlowe and Dash were walking through the school parking lot after classes ended, planning their weekend, when they witnessed something that made them both stop. A larger student had cornered a smaller one by the dumpsters, was pushing him around, escalating toward violence. Marlowe felt her body shift into ready mode automatically. But before she could intervene, Garrett appeared from around the corner. He walked up to the situation, said something Marlowe couldn't hear, and the larger student backed off immediately. Garrett helped the smaller kid gather his dropped belongings, stayed with him until he was safely away, then continued to his truck without noticing he'd been observed. "Holy shit," Dash said quietly. "Yeah," Marlowe agreed. They didn't mention it to Garrett, didn't congratulate him or make a big deal out of it, but Marlowe filed it away as evidence that people could change if they chose to, that cruelty wasn't destiny, that maybe her father had been right about the possibility of redemption even for those who'd lost their way. April brought standardized testing and college preparation stress and the slow countdown to summer. Marlowe and Dash were officially dating, as official as two people could be, while still navigating the weird politics of high school romance. They studied together, climbed together, drove out to the forest preserve on weekends to hike trails and have long conversations about future plans. Dash wanted to study environmental science, maybe forestry or conservation. Marlowe was thinking about criminal justice, maybe something in victim advocacy or rehabilitation programs. Both of them would be applying to colleges in the fall, hoping to find schools close enough that they wouldn't have to choose between education and each other. One afternoon in late April, Marlowe was in the library working on an essay when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her stomach tightened reflexively. Unknown numbers had meant threat for so long. But when she opened it, the message was simple. "This is Garrett. I just wanted you to know that because of everything that happened, I got a second look at my applications and I'm going to therapy school in the fall. Going to become a counselor or something. Figure maybe I can help other kids not be like I was. Anyway, thought you'd want to know your impact. Thanks for not destroying me when you could have." Marlowe stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Good luck. I hope you help a lot of kids." She didn't save his number, and didn't tell Dash about the text until later. But it settled something in her. That final confirmation that the choice she'd made in that hallway, to fight back but with control, to defend herself but not destroy, had been the right one. Violence had been necessary, yes, but bounded violence, controlled violence, violence that stopped when its purpose was accomplished. That was the lesson her father had been trying to teach her all along. May arrived with sudden heat and the frantic energy of a school year ending, final exams, end-of-year projects, college applications submitted and anxiously awaited. The last day of classes came with a feeling of release, students spilling out into sunshine and freedom, summer stretching ahead like a gift. Marlowe and Dash were walking to his car on that last afternoon when they passed the exact spot where Garrett and Trent had shoved her months before. The hallway looked the same lockers, same fluorescent lights, same scuffed linoleum, but everything was different. She was different. The fear that had made her small was gone, replaced by confidence that was quiet but unshakable. She knew what she was capable of now, both the violence and the restraint, and she'd chosen restraint whenever possible. That choice made her stronger, not weaker. "You thinking about it?" Dash asked, noticing her pause. "Yeah. Feels like a long time ago." 4 months, but yeah, also forever. They continued to the parking lot, hands linked, and Marlowe thought about the girl she'd been in September, scared, isolated, carrying her father's death like a weight that might drown her. That girl still existed inside her somewhere, but she'd been joined by someone else, a girl who'd learned that promises could be kept even when bent. That mercy was a choice that required strength, that standing up for yourself didn't mean becoming the thing you hated. In the parking lot, where the sun was hot on the asphalt and other students were celebrating the last day with music and laughter, Marlowe noticed a freshman standing alone by the fence, looking lost and uncomfortable. A few older students were circling, that predatory energy Marlowe recognized instantly from months of experience. The freshman was clutching his backpack straps, trying to be invisible, and Marlowe felt a spike of protective anger. She looked at Dash, who'd noticed it too. "Go," he said simply. Marlowe walked over to the freshman just as one of the older students said something that made him flinch. She positioned herself between them, not aggressive but unmissably present, and met the older student's eyes with the flat stare she'd perfected over the last months. "He's with me," she said quietly. The older student looked at her, recognition dawning. The story of her fight with Garrett had become legend, exaggerated in the retelling but fundamentally true. The new girl who dropped the school's biggest bully without breaking a sweat. The older student backed off with a muttered excuse, his friends following, and Marlowe turned to the freshman. "You okay?" He nodded, eyes wide. "You're Marlowe Thatcher." "Yeah, and you are?" "Beckett. I'm going to be a freshman here next year." "Orientation day?" "Yeah." Marlowe smiled, trying to look reassuring rather than intimidating. "Listen, Beckett, high school can be rough, but you don't have to put up with people pushing you around. And if you need someone to have your back, find me next year, okay? Or find Mr. Cross over there." She gestured to where Dash was waiting by his car. "Good people exist here. You just have to find them." "Did people push you around?" Beckett asked. "For a while?" "Not anymore." "What changed?" Marlowe thought about her answer carefully. "I realized that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and that sometimes you have to show people you won't be pushed. But you can do that without becoming a bully yourself. There's a line between self-defense and cruelty. Stay on the right side of it." Beckett absorbed this seriously. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just remember what I said. And welcome to Oak Ridge." She walked back to Dash, who was grinning. "Making the world better one freshman at a time. Somebody has to." They drove away from school together, windows down, music loud, summer opening up before them like a promise. Marlowe thought about her father, about the promise she'd made, and then broken and then maybe kept in a different way than either of them had intended. She thought about Garrett learning to be better, about the freshman who wouldn't have to face his first year alone, about the ripple effects of choosing mercy over vengeance. That night, lying in bed with her window open to the warm May air, Marlowe pulled out her phone and looked at photos of her father. He was smiling in most of them, proud and strong and alive in ways that hurt to remember. She whispered to his image, hoping wherever he was, he could hear her. "I tried to keep your promise, Dad. I tried so hard, and when I couldn't keep it exactly the way you asked, I tried to keep the spirit of it. I defended myself, but I didn't become cruel. I fought back, but I didn't destroy. I hope that's enough. I hope you'd still be proud." She closed her eyes and imagined she could feel his response. Approval, understanding, love that transcended death and promises and all the complicated ethics of violence and restraint. Her father had given her tools and then asked her not to use them, but maybe that had been the point all along. To know you could hurt someone and choose not to was a different kind of strength than never being able to hurt them at all. To have power and choose mercy, to defend without destroying, to stand up without tearing down. That was the real lesson. That was what he'd been trying to teach her. Summer unfolded warm and lazy, full of climbing trips and coffee shop study sessions and long drives with Dash to nowhere in particular. Marlowe got a part-time job at the gym where she trained, teaching kids classes in basic self-defense and conflict de-escalation. She found she liked teaching, liked seeing kids develop confidence without developing cruelty, liked knowing she was passing on her father's real legacy. Not the violence, but the control of violence, the wisdom of restraint. In August, a week before the new school year would begin, Marlowe received her class schedule in the mail and felt the familiar anxiety spike before remembering she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She was returning to Oak Ridge not as prey, but as someone who'd proven herself capable of survival. She'd walk those hallways with her head high, eat lunch with friends who actually cared about her, study subjects that interested her, and plan for a future that felt possible now. She thought about Beckett, the freshman she'd met on the last day, and wondered if he'd remember her advice. She hoped so. She hoped he'd find his own path through the difficult terrain of adolescence, his own balance between kindness and self-protection. She hoped he'd never have to make the choices she'd made, but if he did, she hoped he'd remember that mercy was always an option, even when violence felt like the only language anyone understood. The night before school started, Dash came over with takeout Thai food, and they ate on her bed, talking about nothing and everything, and at some point he asked her, "Any regrets?" "About what happened last year?" Marlowe considered it honestly. "I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that systems failed and adults failed, and that I was in a position where defending myself physically was the only option left. But I don't regret standing up for myself, and I don't regret choosing controlled response over unlimited violence. That choice, that's the thing I'm proud of." "You should be," Dash said. "You could have hospitalized him, could have done permanent damage. You chose not to. My dad would have wanted that. The control, I mean. He always said the best fighters were the ones who never had to fight because everyone knew they could and chose not to. But if you did have to fight, you fought with just enough force to stop the threat and not a bit more." Sounds like a wise man. He was. I wish you could have met him. I wish I could have too. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and after Dash left, Marlowe stood at her window looking out at the city lights, thinking about the year ahead. She'd be a year older, a year wiser, carrying scar tissue that had made her stronger rather than brittler. She had friends now, and something that felt like love, and a community that had learned to stand up for itself. She had her father's hand wrapped safely in her drawer, and his lessons safely in her heart, adapted and reinterpreted but fundamentally honored. The first day of the new school year dawned bright and hot, late August sun already baking the parking lot when Marlowe and Dash arrived together. Students streamed through the main entrance, fresh faces mixed with familiar ones, the annual reset of hierarchy and hope. Marlowe walked through those doors with her spine straight and her head high, not because she was looking for a fight, but because she'd learned she didn't have to hide from potential ones. In the main hallway, she saw Garrett near his locker, talking to some people she didn't recognize. He caught her eye across the corridor, and for a moment they just looked at each other, not friends, never friends, but no longer enemies either. He nodded slightly. She nodded back. They both turned away to start their respective days, the past acknowledged but not dwelled upon. At lunch, Marlowe sat at a table with Dash and the purple-haired girl whose name was Jess, and 3 other students who'd become genuine friends over the summer. They laughed about teacher assignments and complained about the heat and made plans for the weekend, and it was normal and comfortable and beautiful in its simplicity. This was what high school was supposed to be. Not a battleground, just a place where people grew and learned and figured out who they wanted to become. Midway through lunch, Marlowe noticed Beckett enter the cafeteria, looking overwhelmed by the chaos. He was scanning for somewhere to sit, that familiar expression of someone lost in hostile territory, and Marlowe caught his eye and waved him over. He approached hesitantly. "Remember me?" she asked. "Yeah, of course. Marlowe, right?" "Right. This is Dash and Jess and Marcus and Tiana and Kai. There's room if you want to sit." Beckett's face transformed with relief and gratitude. "Really? That would be great." He sat down and within minutes was absorbed into the group's conversation, the edge of anxiety leaving his shoulders, his smile becoming genuine. Marlowe caught Dash's eye across the table, and he winked at her, understanding without words what this small kindness meant, not just for Beckett, but for the kind of school culture they were trying to build, one intervention at a time. The afternoon passed in the usual chaos of first-day schedules and confused classroom locations, and teachers explaining syllabi. In her last class of the day, AP Literature, the teacher had them go around and share their favorite book. When it came to Marlowe's turn, she talked about a detective novel her father had given her years ago, about a private investigator who solved crimes with intelligence instead of violence, who proved you could be tough without being cruel. She didn't mention that her father had given it to her after that last tournament, as a not-so-subtle message about the kind of person he hoped she'd become. But she thought about it, and she thought he'd be pleased to know the message had finally landed. Walking to the parking lot after school, Marlowe passed the spot where Garrett and Trent had shoved her nearly a year ago. The memory was vivid but distant, like something that had happened to someone else. And in a way it had. That girl was gone, transformed by necessity and choice into someone both harder and kinder, more dangerous and more merciful. The hallway held no fear for her now. Nothing here did. In the parking lot, she noticed a situation developing. 2 larger students surrounding a smaller one, that familiar pattern starting to form. Before she could move, Garrett stepped in, his presence enough to diffuse the situation without a word spoken. The larger students backed off, and Garrett said something to the smaller one that made them nod gratefully. He was keeping his word, Marlowe realized, becoming better, actually doing the work. "You see that?" Dash asked, following her gaze. "Yeah. People can change, if they choose to. That's the important part, the choice." They drove to their coffee shop, their unofficial headquarters, and ordered their usual terrible drinks and sat by the window watching traffic and people, and the ordinary miracle of another day survived and even enjoyed. Marlowe thought about the year ahead, about college applications and decisions about the future, and all the small daily choices that would shape who she became. She thought about her promise to her father and how she'd kept it in spirit if not in letter, how she'd learned that sometimes promises needed to evolve with you, needed to be interpreted through lived experience rather than followed as rigid law. "What are you thinking about?" Dash asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. "How different everything is from a year ago. How much I've changed." "Good changes?" "Mostly, yeah. I'm not afraid anymore. And I know I can protect myself, but I also know I don't have to be a weapon walking around looking for threats. There's a balance." "You found it," Dash said simply. "I'm working on it. still learning. Aren't we all? They sat there until the sun started to set, painting the sky orange and pink, and Marlowe felt something like peace settle in her chest. Not the absence of conflict. There would always be conflict, that was part of living, but the confidence that she could handle whatever came, that she had tools and friends and hard-won wisdom to draw on. She'd survived her trial by fire and come out the other side not as a victim or a bully, but as someone who'd learned the hardest lesson. That real strength was measured not by the damage you could inflict, but by the damage you chose not to. That night, before bed, Marlowe took out her father's hand wrap one more time. She traced his initials with her finger, gold thread catching the light, and she made him a new promise, to use what he'd taught her wisely, to defend the vulnerable, to stand up for herself and others, but never to cross the line into cruelty, never to become the thing she'd been fighting against, to choose mercy whenever possible, violence only when necessary, and always to remember that the point of being strong was to protect, not to dominate. She folded the wrap carefully and put it back in her drawer, then opened her window to the warm night air. Somewhere in the city, people were living their lives, making their choices, becoming who they'd be. Garrett was hopefully doing the work to be better. Beckett was starting his high school journey with a little more support than most freshmen got. Dash was probably asleep already, exhausted from the first day back. Her mother was working another night shift, saving lives, making the world marginally better through small acts of care and competence. And Marlowe was here, alive, intact, stronger than she'd been and still growing into who she'd become. The journey from victim to survivor to defender to teacher, it had been brutal and necessary and transformative. She wouldn't wish it on anyone, but she also wouldn't trade it because it had taught her things that couldn't be learned any other way. About resilience and restraint, about mercy and justice, about keeping promises even when they had to bend, about the difference between power and violence, between strength and cruelty, between standing up and tearing down. She climbed into bed, set her alarm for tomorrow, and closed her eyes. The last thing she thought before sleep took her was simple, but profound. She'd survived. She'd more than survived. She'd transformed her survival into something that might help others survive too. The cycle of violence ended when someone chose to end it, and she'd made that choice. Not perfectly, not without cost, but definitively. That was enough. That was victory. Not the dramatic kind with cheering crowds and clear-cut endings, but the real kind, the kind measured in small daily choices to be better than you were yesterday, to extend mercy when you could have extended fists, to build up instead of tear down, to remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about and therefore deserves at least the chance at kindness. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and go to school and keep building the life she wanted. She'd study and laugh with friends and climb walls and plan for a future that felt possible now. She'd help Beckett navigate his freshman year and keep an eye out for other students who needed someone to have their back. She'd continue learning how to balance her training with her values, her capacity for violence with her commitment to peace. And every day she'd honor her father by being the kind of person he'd hoped she'd become. Strong enough to fight, wise enough to know when not to, compassionate enough to choose mercy, and brave enough to stand up when standing up was the only option left. That was the real lesson. That was the promise that mattered. And that was the person Marlowe Thatcher was still becoming, one choice at a time.